Hello, everyone. As Deb was kind enough to introduce me, I am Robert. I'm one of the adult services librarians. You can find me upstairs. Um, Today's program is titled the Electoral College, Asset or Defect. When kind of in conjunction with the Smithsonian exhibit, we were kind of like thinking of different kind of programming opportunities we would have here at the library to offer parallel to it. And Deb had asked me to think of some kind of topics that would be very relevant, especially in today's current political climate. What would benefit the most for the community? And I do think that the Electoral College is probably one of the most important, if not misunderstood aspects of our democracy. It's what it is, what its role is, how people react to it, and essentially going forward, what will it be in the future? So today's program, I will discuss what it is. I'll kind of go over the mechanisms of it, why it is the way it is, and talk about what's good with it, what's bad with it, and what kind of ideas that people have brought forth to kind of reform it if it doesn't work for them, what worked for our country. So to start, what is the Electoral College? Most people have heard of it. Every time there's an election, it's the Electoral College. What it is it's a process and not necessarily a place. Okay. It's not a specific building. It's not a specific static group of people. What it is, it changes every single election cycle with different people in the Electoral College. And how it starts is it starts with the selection of actual electors, and that is done through the indirect election for the president. So there are electors that are slated for political parties. And when people do cast their ballots, they're casting for the Republican candidate, the Democrat candidate, one of the third-party candidates. What they're technically voting for is an elector that is pledged to vote for that candidate in their state. So once the general election is over, then the results are in. Whoever has won said state will essentially have that elector meet later after the election in December to technically cast their votes for the president and vice president. That is party specific, and the parties are the ones that essentially decide that, as well as states, because most election matters are decided by state policy. It's not a federal standard. So individual states will have different rules for how parties can nominate their actual electors. And typically I'll talk about it. It's usually people who are party players, like people who they know have loyalty to their party and will vote how they want to vote. So once they cast their votes, that is when the technical, officially the person who ran for president is actually elected for president. And then in January is when the votes from the electors are certified by Congress. And that is, then a couple weeks later is inauguration for the new president, the new administration. How it actually works. So every state has electoral votes, as well as the District of Columbia. There are, as of now, a total of 538 presidential electors all throughout the country. And like I mentioned before, every party will have their own person that will get picked based on the results of the general election that we, the people, do vote for. Typically, it is the majority to 270. Whoever gets at least 270 will win the election. And then there is some stipulations, and it is constitutional. It's written in the Constitution that if there is a tie, and it is totally possible, however, very, very unlikely, that the ties are decided by the House of Representatives. So the House of Representatives, after it's determined that if there is a tie, and it has happened in history before, very early on in our country's history, the House of Representatives are the ones that vote, and every state votes as a block. So it's just one vote per state. And they are the ones that determine, they vote one way or the other to determine who the actual president will be. That has only happened twice in history. You'll see the image that is the total of the allotment for electoral votes in every single state in DC. That is, if someone wins that state, they get those electoral votes. It is a winner takes all system for 48 plus DC, 48 states plus DC. So just based on popular vote, whoever gets the most wins all those electoral votes, with the exception of Maine and Nebraska. Maine and Nebraska, they have 2 electoral votes assigned in this manner, while the remaining electoral votes are allocated based on plurality in each congressional district. I should state that the votes are determined every census, so every 10 years, when population is apportioned based on congressional representation. That's what determines electoral votes for each state. You get based on number of congressional delegates, and that includes the House of Representatives and the Senate. So every state has 2 senators, so that's 2 electoral votes, and the minimum number of Congress people that they can have from the House is 1. So the minimum number of electoral votes a state will have is 3, and then it just goes up from there. And it's obviously capped at 538, just based on the apportionment laws for Congress. So until there's a constitutional amendment that increases the amount of Congress people in our government, that's where it will remain. Yes.
I don't understand Maine and Nebraska. What do they do?
So there's an at-large election. So like every other state, if whoever gets the most votes, that's who the electoral votes go to. That's based on the 2 senators' votes, those 2 votes that come from the senator counting. And then there is the congressional district votes. So look at how the Congress, how the districts are drawn in Maine and Nebraska, and each of those count as 1 vote. So, if one congressional district votes Democrat, while another one votes Republican, they're split votes. So they get a portion to each candidate. Whereas it could be a completely different vote for the at-large votes, those 2 other ones. So you'll see that Nebraska has 5, and then Maine has 4. So there's the 2 from the senators, the at-large votes, and then each of them 2 from Maine and 3 from Nebraska that get divvied up based on which party wins that congressional district.
I would like to hold questions until the end, so I'm gonna go get some papers so you can write them down. And to the people online too, hold questions until the end. We will have a Q&A session. I just know that he's got a lot to get through, so I'm gonna go get some paper.
I mentioned before the whole process of the Electoral College. How we vote for the electors technically, and then they essentially select the president, and then the votes are certified. So it's pretty much the electors of each state will, once the general election is over, the electors will meet in the state capitol on the first Tuesday after the second Wednesday of December to cast their votes. And then the results are sent to and counted by the Congress, where they're tabulated in the first week of January, before a joint meeting of the Senate and the House of Representatives, presided over by the current vice president, because they are the president of the Senate. If we're familiar with the last election on January 6th, that's what happened with that. During the incident that happened at the Capitol, that was what they were currently in the process of doing. Talking about the origins and the history of the election. So how did the founders kind of just land on this system of voting? I will say that we are the only country that does elect our head of government, head of state, this manner. it was essentially during the Constitutional Convention where these debates would be had. This was just under the umbrella of, we have a president now, and how do we pick the president? There are a lot of different ways that people can choose their head of government. There are parliamentary systems like in the UK where it's essentially just whatever party gets the most votes, that has the most people in the government, they choose their leader and they're the ones that run parliament. Or just a straight up national popular vote. Just the most people in the country vote, and that's who the winner is. This was more of a compromise between the election of the president by a vote in Congress. So it was seen as that wasn't a beneficial method because of the checks and balances between the different branches of government. They kind of wanted to remove that aspect where it wasn't the legislature deciding who the executive was. And then you had the other side where it was the election of the president by just a popular vote of whoever qualified as a citizen. The founders were very leery of demagoguery. So just mob rule. So, simple majority wins wasn't really how they set up our system because they kind of saw the negative effects of that. So this was seen as a compromise, kind of infusing both systems where you did have a role to play as the average citizen, combined with what seemed to be the qualified government officials that could make these kind of decisions. An agreement that was that it balanced between the interests of smaller and larger states. It goes back to how they decided the legislature, where it was, either representation based on population size or representation just equal across the board. So that was a way to kind of combine the interests of both of those. At the time, communication and transportation were obviously incredibly slow. And the country was largely agrarian. It was mostly farmland. The framers were concerned about the ability of voters in distant areas to be informed enough to make decisions about the national leadership. So they took a lot of things into consideration, because if you weren't necessarily in the midst of it, of the government process and stuff like that, you would have no clue who to vote for necessarily. So they didn't really trust the average person to make an informed decision. The structure can be traced back to the ancient Roman Republic. And the actual term elector does come from the Holy Roman Empire, where they had the principalities act as electors and choose essentially the Holy Roman Emperor. So there's a lot of historical influence that the founders did kind of pull to develop the modern democracy that we do have today. There was an original plan that we do not follow in the Constitution. It has been amended. The original plan, which is in Article 2 of the Constitution, provided that the electors would vote twice. So once electors were selected, they would get 2 votes. There were a slew of candidates. They could put 2 votes on, put a vote on one person, put a vote on another person. And what it was that the person that got the most votes became president, and the person that got the next amount of votes became vice president. That obviously led to a few issues, especially if they were from different parties, which happened the first few elections until they were like, oh, this is a problem. Maybe we should change this. It's happened before where there was a tie between Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, where they both received 73 electoral votes. They were from the same party. I'm sorry, they were not from the same party. But ironically, it was Jefferson that ultimately prevailed. Because people from Aaron Burr's party were like, don't vote for him. Don't vote for Aaron Burr, because they just saw the actual character of a candidate as opposed to plain party loyalty. So Jefferson won that election. And then as a result, in 1804, the 12th Amendment was passed, where electors now cast separate votes for president and vice president. It prevented ties from candidates from the same party by clarifying roles. And it ensured vice presidents did politically align with the president. So you didn't have kind of a cabinet that was at odds with each other, like in previous elections at the start of the country, where, John Adams was president and Thomas Jefferson was vice president, and they were completely polar opposites in terms of politics. Although the United States Constitution refers to electors, neither the phrase the phrase Electoral College does not actually appear in there. It wasn't until the 19th century that the name Electoral College came into even general usage to refer to the collective designation for the electors. The phrase was eventually written into federal law in 1845 in the United States Code. So it wasn't something initially just, like I mentioned before, constitutionally, the aspect of it was there, but the name Electoral College wasn't. And now talking about political parties and the electors, I mentioned before that the role that parties play, what it is that each candidate running for president has their own group of electors. It's known as a slate. They are selected before the election, so everyone knows that if the Republican candidate wins, these are the people that are going to be the electors for those electoral votes, or the same thing for the Democrats. Everyone's going to know who's going to be who. The slates are generally chosen by the candidate's political party in your state. So like, the political party, the Republican Party of Texas, the Democratic Party of New York, they're the ones that determine who their own electors are. The state's law, like I before mentioned, the states do kind of decide their own rules and regulations for how electors are chosen and how the parties are managed within their states. There's no just across the board standard for it. I mentioned before, electors are often party leaders, activists, or individuals with strong party ties because they want to ensure loyalty to their party. They want to make sure that these people are actually going to vote for their candidate because there is an idea of faithless electors. It's someone who does not cast an electoral vote for the candidate that their party actually pledged for. So they may have been selected for the position of an elector, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they are going to actually vote for that candidate. We see it all the time with political parties that there's infighting, disagreements, and it can show out as like essentially a protest vote for people. You'll see on the map in the image that this is the turnout of the electoral votes for the actual electoral votes for the 2016 election. There were actually a number of faithless electors that you had all across the country. You have people voting for Colin Powell. You have people voting for Ron Paul or John Kasich or Bernie Sanders. It just showed the kind of idea that there are people within the party that don't necessarily agree toe the party line. Different states have different rules on how to handle faithless electors. In a majority of the states, it is illegal for faithless electors to essentially make an independent vote. Pretty much they can be fined or disqualified or even just flat out removed, saying like, well, you're not going to vote for that, then we're getting rid of you and just replacing you with someone else. Once again, goes back to the states decide this. And it's important to note that the idea of the Electoral College does provide for the dominance of a two-party system. So it is difficult for third-party candidates to kind of come into the fold with the electoral votes kind of at stake because of that winner-takes-all system. Regardless of if they do get one or two electoral votes with faithless electors have never decided elections. They are inconsequential, and they are more of a political statement. What's something that is really important to kind of discuss when it comes to elections and the electoral votes are battleground states or swing states. They are states where both political major parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, have very, very similar levels of support. They are often very unpredictable, where the outcome literally won't be figured out until election day. They are critical in determining the outcome, and it's just the outcome of the presidential presidential elections due to their electoral or vote importance. Because they do often carry a lot of electoral votes. Think of Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and North Carolina in this past election. Swing states do change. This is kind of one of the, talking about like the defects of it. People think, oh, why does Ohio get to decide everything, or Pennsylvania? It's not always the case. States like New York, even Florida, used to be swing states in past elections. It just shows the shifting demographics of the electorate of who gets to vote. Swing states are just more important in the general election based on whatever the swing state is at the time. So they do change. They're not always the same states. It just depends on, the demographic information from it. In close elections, a small shift in the votes in these states can change the entire outcome. So that's why they are usually the focus of candidates' campaigns. This is where like third-party spoilers do come in. You saw it in 2000 in Florida. You saw it in 2016 in some of the swing states. That's why these candidates do focus so much time and money trying to kind of solidly win the states, because they are very important. They kind of know what's going to happen in a lot of other states, where they tend to neglect the voters in those non-competitive states. You think a lot of the Midwest that always vote Republican, the West Coast always votes Democrat, the Northeast always votes Democrat, the South always votes Republican. It's kind of something that it's taken advantage of, because they know they're going to get those votes. So why bother campaigning? Why bother listening to their ideas or anything like that? Or kind of like, rubbing elbows with them. They will typically kind of pay lip service just based on their platforms that, they are candidates that support them. But when it comes to rallies and in person and meet and greets and stuff, you do find that candidates do focus on just these swing states. And it does lead to a lot of voter disenfranchisement, where, you have a majority of one party in one state that always votes that way. So you do have a significant minority of voters who are never heard. They are the minority, and they have been a perpetual minority. So that does lead to a lot of apathy and resentment in a lot of states, because, they kind of can't change anything as a minority. And that kind of plays into the winner takes all system of the Electoral College, because even though they're voting, and even though the election isn't that far apart, they still exist and they still vote for the other candidate. Their voices essentially just go unheard, because simple 51% goes to one side. Talking about controversial elections, there have been several throughout the centuries that our country has existed. I talked about the election of 1800, which literally led to the amendment being passed in the Constitution for the Electoral College. But looking at this graphic, these are some pretty big elections where we talk about, how the Electoral College essentially decided one way as opposed to another way that maybe the electorate didn't support. The election of 1876, it was extremely controversial and hyperpartisan. Voting results were contradictory from several states. They were receiving two different amounts from depending on which party you were in, saying, this state voted, they voted Republican, and then another group would say, no, they voted Democrat. So it was conflicting reports, and it was a whole mess. And if you think over 150 years ago, how hard it is to get accurate information today, how, impossibly hard it was to get back then. An independent commission was developed. It was a majority Republican one. It was 8-7. What ended up happening was the compromise of it's actually 1877. I put 1876, is the compromise of 1877, which ended Reconstruction in the South. That was a big political issue for Democrats at the time. They actually ceded the election. They said, you know what, fine, you can have it. Give it to the Republican, who was Rutherford B. Hayes. And as long as the federal Reconstruction in the South ended, the federal troops would leave and the South would be left alone to essentially govern themselves under Democratic control. So that's pretty much how that was solved. Then the election of 1888, it's kind of similar to recent elections where simply the candidate who won the most of the popular vote did not actually win the electoral majority. Cleveland did win a plurality of the votes, meaning he did win the most, but not necessarily the 51%. But it did end up leaving Benjamin Harrison, and it just depends on what state you're in and how many votes go in that state. Benjamin Harrison was the one that won that election, but just based on electoral votes alone. And as history has now repeated, Grover Cleveland would end up winning the following election, both popular and electoral votes. So the election of 2000, which is probably something many of you kind of lived through, it was extremely controversial, and kind of, usually the day after who the president is. Wasn't in this case, with it being essentially decided by the Supreme Court. It did come down to Florida, came down to here, where recounts upon recounts were ordered, determining who actually was the winner. This is one of those, it wouldn't really be this close if there weren't third-party candidates, if it was just between the two parties. George W. Bush did not receive the popular vote, but the Supreme Court ended the recounts and declared him the winner of Florida, and Florida was the linchpin that decided the election. And it was, even though Gore won the popular vote, Bush won the electoral vote, very, very, very narrowly. And then, of course, the most recent controversial election was the election of 2016, where what the issue was with the Electoral College. It renewed efforts to reform because the popular vote was significantly in Hillary Clinton's favor, but Donald Trump, because he won in the key states, in those battleground states, in those swing states, that's what decided the election. He won the electoral majority. And that's just, it shows that, from 150 years ago, 200 years ago, the Electoral College kind of was always like a little pin in the side of, is this really truly representative democracy, when it doesn't reflect the will of the majority of the people, the mob rule, the majority, 51%. Now kind of going to the question at hand, what's good about the Electoral College? Why do we have it? Is it worth it? And what I have here are essentially broad generalizations of, kind of in defense of why the Electoral College does exist. What it does is it does encourage broad geographical representation. It ensures that the presidential candidates must gain support from across the country. It doesn't limit it to just cities. That's because that's really where the most population is. You visit the 10, 15 most populous cities, and that's going to be the majority of the electorate. That because that's where most people do live. And that's the idea of balancing it between just simple majority or kind of the federalist idea, the federalism, where states kind of have a role to play with the nation at whole, not just the individual person. It does promote national unity by requiring candidates to appeal to diverse regions. So, you're not just campaigning to Northeast, Ivy educated elite or farmers in the Midwest or farmers in the Rust Belt or anything like that. You're not just focusing on one area. You are kind of forced to campaign in other regions of the country and kind of build a coalition of voters that can support your platform. Another thing is it does safeguard minority interests. I mentioned before that the idea of putting it in place was that mob rule kind of was feared, the demagoguery, just saying, oh, majority rules, they win, they get to decide everything. What it does is it prevents tyranny of the majority, is what's called. So it protects smaller states and rural areas from being overshadowed by larger and more populous states and cities. Each state has a minimum of 3 electoral votes, which gives less populous states a louder voice in the selection of presidents. Because when we're looking at how population is divided, the minimum is 3. But if we actually look at the total population, you can just simply say, like, based on congressional representation, votes are apportioned differently based on the state you're in. Because if you're in California, one congressional representative can represent 100,000 people, whereas in Wyoming, because there is at least a minimum, they could represent 90,000 people. That's the kind of the idea, is that because there is that baseline and there is a cap of how many congressional representatives there are, some people are going to essentially be disenfranchised, and people's votes are going to matter more or less. Another thing is it provides a clear and decisive outcome. This is something straight from the constitutional debates. The system typically produces a clear winner. When you're looking at electoral votes, it usually is just, hey, this is the winner. It's very much fewer people actually voting. So it's clear, like, who they're voting for. There's, it's something that's done in person, that can be recorded and counted, as opposed to, the general electorate, who are going to voting booths all over across the country, where anything can happen from A to B, with these votes, whether they're altered or go missing or people forget, or, it's just the idea that, the Electoral College is something that's much more, transparent and accountable. And it does avoid a scenario where a candidate, avoids where the candidate, it does, I'm sorry, that's not what I was meant to say. The next one is it encourages coalition building and moderation, which is what I talked about before, kind of appealing to different states and regions. They do have to build a broad coalition of states, leading to more moderate policies. So when you think of a candidate who is extremely one side or the other on the political spectrum, it's not going to be seen favorably by everyone. It may appeal to a certain base, but unless they actually do have a platform that can be seen by different groups of people, they're not going to get a general support from the electorate in the general election. It does encourage bipartisanship, and it does reduce the focus on extreme partisan divides. And finally, the idea that it does strengthen the role of states in the political process. I mentioned the idea of federalism. It just reflects the federal nature of the United States government. That was its initial intention when the Constitution was written. It isn't just a collection of people, it is a collection of states, and that there is a level of political authority that is granted to the states as opposed to just the individual person. We've literally fought wars over it in our own country. It's just a balancing act of how important is personal individual autonomy versus state autonomy. Does it matter that there's 10 million people in one state and 30 million people in another state? It goes back to congressional representation and how that's balanced with the Senate and the House of Representatives. And it just goes back to, that's why the Electoral College exists, because it does balance that. Now, on the flip side, when we're talking about assets, there's always defects of, why is it bad? One of the most popular kind of arguments that's just had is just it overrules the popular vote. The Electoral College can result with a president, and like I mentioned before, it's happened several times, where someone does not win the popular vote, but does win the electoral vote. People do view it as undemocratic, and it's once again back to that balancing act of, how important is, a state's representation versus an individual's representation. We have the idea of the overrepresentation of small states. Small states receive a minimum of 3 votes, regardless of their population. This gives voters in less populated states more influence per vote than those in larger states. And just, I mentioned that as almost a positive because of the balancing act. As a negative, it's, well, why does their vote matter more than mine? Like, it generates resentment for people. It's like, maybe I should live in the smaller state, so my vote matters more. It's just both sides of that kind of coin on whether or not it's right for someone in a smaller state to have more representation when it comes to picking the president. The winner-take-all system. That is one of the big issues, and it's fairly bipartisan in terms of a general electorate thing of why it's an issue. because it's an issue on both sides, whether you're in a heavily Democratic state or a heavily Republican state, there is the minority vote that is essentially often ignored. So the only two states that kind of don't fall under this are Maine and Nebraska, like I mentioned before. Voters in states that consistently lean toward one party may feel that their vote doesn't matter. Just because the idea of they're a safe state, for a Republican, Alabama is a safe state. For a Democrat, California is a safe state, so there's no reason for them to kind of like focus anything on there. And on the flip side, there's no pushback from the other side because they are such a minority in there. They do exist. There are Republicans in California. There are Democrats in Alabama. They do exist. They do have, local representation in some areas, but on a scale of the statewide, it does not usually reflect that. The focus on swing states is typically seen as a big defect because I'll keep beating the dead horse. Candidates focusing on the campaigns where only the outcome is uncertain. We have polling data that, comes in and shows essentially from every state, all these companies poll, voters saying, who do you support? And you see, overwhelming support from one side or the other on a bunch of these different states, reinforcing the idea of a safe state. And it just leaves, even if they're in a safe state, voting for the majority, they are neglected. Everyone in those safe states are neglected by candidates. They don't necessarily have to fight for your issues because you're going to vote for them no matter what. That's the candidate's mindset, or at least the party as a national standards mindset is we need to focus on Michigan. We need to win Michigan. We don't need to worry about Oregon or something like that. It just takes the attention away, and it highlights, hyper focuses on states that necessarily don't even represent the general electorate. Their issues are their issues, but because we don't know who's going to win there, we need to win there. So let's focus all our time and money there. And in conjunction, it does, discourage voter turnout. So there was, I couldn't find the graphic for it, but there is the idea that if there is a third candidate of no one, that in almost a majority of the states, they would be the winners, because not everyone votes. A large portion of the country does not vote. And if they did turn out to vote, it could flip the election. There's numbers of reasons as to why people wouldn't want to vote. Whether they know, I know the Democrat's going to win, why bother voting? I don't need to vote for my candidate because he's going to win, or I don't need to vote for my candidate because he's going to lose. Who cares? So there's just a lot of apathy in that respect. Faithless electors, as I was talking about them before, they are expected to vote according to their state's outcome, but they aren't always legally obligated to do so. That is seen as a defect of the system because, there is no guarantee that whatever is reflected in the general election by the electorate, they're voting for these electors. There is a scenario where a majority of the electors are faithless electors. Whether or not the states are the ones that have to enforce the rules. The first time that there was an actual enforcement on faithless electors by states was in 2016. There, I believe, have been about 150 faithless electors in history. But this 2016 was the first time that any of the rules that were in place by the state political parties were actually enforced, whether people were disqualified or fined, or removed or disqualified in any way. So just that whole idea that, there's not a guarantee in every single state on who these people are going to vote for, that does post, a question mark, even though it hasn't happened before. There is the idea that the Electoral College just overcomplicates the election process. Everyone kind of wishes that, hey, I cast my vote for Kamala Harris, or I cast my vote for Donald Trump. That's who my vote should be for. I don't understand why my vote isn't just one, why doesn't that matter? The Electoral College acts as a middleman. It introduces an additional layer between voters and the presidency, the idea of like a buffer. It makes the election process less direct and just more complex, because, it drags it out. We think everything's decided on, the first Tuesday of November, but it's actually in December that it's decided, and it's in January that it's made official. So, critics just argue for a much more simpler, direct, popular vote, that would just make it, just easier for the public to understand. Kind of the opposite of, the founders when they set the system up, that, oh, we can't trust their knowledge, the average person, the average farmer who can vote, like they have no idea what's going on. So, we'll make the decision for them, by having them just pick the people that they want, to choose the president. And then, I mentioned before the idea of third parties and polarization, partisan polarization. The Electoral College does reinforce the two-party system, by creating insurmountable structural barriers for third-party candidates. It discourages political diversity and limits voters' choices. And it does impact the democratic process by restricting viable representation from all viewpoints in the presidential election. There aren't just two people, there aren't just two platforms and two choices to make. The idea of that is, it is frankly absurd. There are plenty of people who have differing opinions within the same party, but the idea that it's like, oh, well, if, the person in this party doesn't win, then the person who has the complete opposite views of me is going to win. So I just have to, vote for the party, otherwise, they're the boogeyman, they're the bad guy. You just got to vote this way. We'll figure it out later. So it does discourage third parties and alternate viewpoints, from entering political discourse. And there are, as I will talk about, there are going to be some kind of alternatives and proposals that can kind of alter a lot of these defects. So talking about the alternatives and proposals, because it is something that is enshrined in the Constitution, it would take a constitutional amendment to technically change the process. There actually have been over 700 proposals for reform for the Electoral College. That is the most a single issue, most something in the Constitution for one single issue has ever received, has ever like kind of been put forward, for changing, and nothing has happened. So that kind of says something, that that there has been this constant and multitude of ideas of how to fix it, how to reform it, how to get rid of it. The closest it ever came was in, aside from changing it with the amendment in 1804, was in 1969, where there was a measure for it to be passed, by the House, but the Senate rejected it. So, it has been brought up to the Congress, in one way or another to change it or reform it. But it is still ultimately up to the states to decide, how their process is, and ultimately up to a constitutional amendment, to change it nationwide. Looking at some of the ideas, the first and foremost, most common one that people say is just to abolish it. Just get rid of the Electoral College and resort to a national popular vote. It ensures that the president will reflect the majority of voters. It's simple as that, just majority wins. Eliminating the possibility of a candidate winning the presidency without actually winning majority of votes. It's just argued that it'll be more fair, democratic, and a direct representation of the will of the people. So this would just be a counter proposal to the ideas set up by the founders, the idea of mob rule, majority. Yeah, I say mob rule as it's like a negative thing. That is what they kind of implied with it. Just some kind of person just saying, hey, everyone vote for this, without any actual considerations. But, that's the idea, is that, there's, 100 million of us, and, 51 million want it this way. Why can't we have it this way? So that is pretty much the most basic one. Another one, which is definitely a little more complicated and does require some explanation, is ranked choice voting for president. So one of the deterrents, for people voting for president is, if I don't vote for this guy, that guy's going to win. And I don't want that to happen. Even though I don't agree with this guy, it's the lesser of two evils kind of thing. It's infuriating. And I hear it every single time. that, it's like, oh, this election is too important to vote for a third party candidate or something like that. I need to vote for this person so this person doesn't get in. The ranked choice voting, which is in other countries like Australia, is just a different kind of ballot process where you're essentially given a list of the candidates. And what you do is you vote essentially like, this is my first vote. This is my second vote, in order from I want this person to be president to I least want this person to be president. And what happens is it essentially how a lot of states have runoff elections. So if that's the case, you don't have to worry about like, oh, my vote's wasted on a third party, so, the other party that I hate more than this one is going to win because I wasted my vote on a third party candidate. The idea is that, if a majority of people feel that way, then they do have the option to vote for a third party and they don't have to worry about that actually influencing the election. Because what it is it's just an automatic runoff. So based on the amount of votes, it says whoever the top X amount of people get the votes, they're the ones that are in consideration, and then everyone else falls out. And then those votes that are for the candidates that are knocked out, essentially it goes to the people's second choice. And it kind of just keeps going like that until you do get that, true representative idea of, what people want. So that's why it's ranked choice. It's, I may want the Democrat, I may want the Republican, or, vice versa, but I want this third party person more. And it kind of gives people the confidence that if I pick that third party person, even though if other people don't pick them, then I know that my vote will go to, one of the two parties to prevent that, going back to that lesser of two evils kind of thing. So that one's pretty interesting. And like I said, it reduces the spoiler effect of third parties. The congressional district system is another idea for a proposal. That is essentially what Maine and Nebraska are doing if it was adopted nationwide. You have those two senator electorate votes, that are going to be an at-large, depending on what your state is, they go the way your state goes. But what it is it's pretty much going to lead to split votes in every single state, where depending on your congressional district, that they're going to vote. If your congressman is a Republican, it is likely your electoral vote will be a Republican. And if your congressman is a Democrat, it is likely your electoral vote, will turn out to be a Democrat. So, you look at states like California or Texas, it will narrow down the electoral kind of votes a little differently, where there is going to be representation from both parties. It does give more weight to regional preferences, and it does reduce the dominance of a single party in one state. It tosses out the winner takes all. So people are actually getting to see some a competition. And what it does is it's not like that's a safe state, I got it. No, now you need to go campaign in different congressional districts if you really want it, because a lot of the times voting is much more closer in congressional districts as opposed to statewide as a whole. So that's the idea. It just leads to more proportional representation in electoral votes. And the next one, this one is an actual like, it's a regional compact, the idea of a regional compact. What it is, it's called the National Popular Vote Interstate Pact, and this is what the graphic is kind of representing. These states have adopted measures in their state governments that no matter what happens with an election, whoever wins the popular vote, these states will have their electoral votes go to the popular vote. The idea is that it's to kind of get rid of the idea that someone doesn't win the popular vote, but wins the electoral vote. It's only been approved in these states. There are a few other states that have it, like, kind of pending in their state legislature. The idea is that for them to get to the majority mark, so that once there's enough states where they have that 270 threshold, they don't even need to worry about other states kind of joining this interstate compact. It's just the idea that it'll align the Electoral College with the popular vote. You can see that it's majority of states that do tend to go for Democrats at the moment. You know, like I said, that can change with demographics. So that is the idea, like, you know, because it has been Democrats that have lost the popular vote in recent years, have won the popular vote in recent years and lost the electoral vote. So that's, you know, the idea is that the reform is pushed from that party's side in those states. Yeah, as of now, only several states have actually signed on to the compact. And the idea that it's null and void at this point. Yes, they have agreed to it, but nothing is legally binding or anything. It's only when enough states join to hit that 270 will then it go in effect into those, like, you know, the state laws for it. This is something that will 100% be challenged in court in the federal government, essentially because it's the states making their own decisions and ignoring what their voters are, because the voters can go one way. So it's something that'll be, it'll be a constitutional question, it'll be a legal question if it actually gets implemented. But it is an alternative that has been proposed. And finally, what I have here is the dual system of electors. It is a hybrid model. Kind of like the compromises that were made for the Electoral College on how it functions. What it does is this just adds in, you know, another kind of monkey wrench to it, where it combines the Electoral College with the popular vote system. So instead of them being two independent things, and in that kind of the electoral process mechanism, what it is it would adjust the number of electors based on a mix of state-based and national vote totals. The idea is that it'll balance state representation and the principle of majority rule, create kind of combining the popular vote and the electoral vote. So it's the idea of tweaking with the metrics of what has more weight and what doesn't. So the idea is it'll just create a more balanced approach in how elections turn out. These are just some of the reference I used when I was looking up some information. That is the end of the presentation. I will field some questions and answer to the best of my ability. The idea of this was just kind of to inform people on what the Electoral College was, how it works, why it's the system that we have today, what's wrong with it, what's good about it, and, you know, what can we do going forward with it? If it will stay in place, if it will change. You know, it's just going to depend on us, the people. And like I mentioned before, probably a constitutional amendment. So.
All right, thank you. We're going to go into Q&A now, but I'm going to stop the recording before we do that. So hang around, people online. Thanks for joining today.